Greetings again, and welcome to another video. It's a blustery, cold, wintry day here in just outside of Washington, D.C. Well, it's not really that cold, but it's snowing, nothing sticking, but that just makes things sloppy. Anyway, what I want to do today is start on my Arch install video on VirtualBox. This is one I was going to do earlier, but it ended up being real long when I started talking about getting VirtualBox installed, and I realized I had to talk about partitioning and then about installing Arch. But I've done videos on the other two, so this one's on the Arch install on VirtualBox. So I'm going to get to it right now. Arch GNU Linux install on VirtualBox. This is what we're going to be covering in this video. First, getting an Arch Linux ISO image. Then we'll talk a little bit about using VirtualBox. We'll create a virtual machine for our Arch install. We will boot up that virtual machine using an Arch RAM Linux image. We will do some customization of that RAM image for your particular situation. Then we'll go ahead and install Arch to the virtual drive. We'll configure Arch on that virtual drive, and finally we will boot up that virtual drive for the first time and play around just a little bit with the image we've created. Getting Arch Linux. Simply open your browser and point it at archlinux.org. This will take you to the home page of the Arch Linux website. It should probably be the first entry that comes back for your browser. You want to go up to the upper right and click on the download link. Scroll to the bottom of the page. I'm assuming you're going to be doing a HTTP download here. Find a mirror in your country that's geographically close to you. This will hopefully improve the speed of the download. When you select the mirror, you'll be brought to a file folder. Click on the checksums at the bottom of the file. Copy these and put them in a text file. Save them to your desktop for later use. You've got several files in here. You'll notice that the Arch Linux x86 ISO is the same size as the one with the date in the title, and also the compressed files are the same size. If you look at your checksums file, you'll see that they have the same checksums basically too. So these are basically all the same files. It doesn't matter which one you download. I usually go for the one with the date in case I have multiple downloads in a folder. I know which one's the latest. If you download one of the zip files, you're going to have to unzip it on your computer before you can use it. Now that you've downloaded your Arch ISO, you can go ahead and validate it. There are a couple of ways to do this. If you are on a Windows computer, you can use the cert utility with the -hash file option. If you're on Linux, you can just use the SHA-256 sum with a file name. Both these are done from the command line. There are also GUI alternatives. You can look around and find some. Alternately, in conjunction, you can download the SIG file from the same website and use the pacman-key with the -v option. Either way, the choice is up to you, but I suggest you validate the file in some manner before using it. Using VirtualBox. Let's discuss a little about VirtualBox. Just to keep us all on the same page, I've talked about this before. Looking at About VirtualBox under the Help menu, you can see we're using 7.0 version. If we go to Tools and Activities, we can monitor how our system's doing. We can look at our available CPU, disk system RAM usage. Depending on if you're running multiple boxes, this can be really helpful. Here we're looking at whether we have the VirtualBox extensions pack installed. If it's not, we can add it. So going back to the welcome screen, this is where we're going to be working from. Creating an Arch virtual machine. We will start from the VirtualBox welcome screen, where we will click on the new icon to start the wizard. Here we need to fill out a name. Let's give it one that'll mean something to us later on. I'm calling mine Arch Base. Right below the name, we have the directory that the virtual machine will be stored in. I'm using the default here. Then we select the ISO that we're going to use to create it. If you gave the name as something VirtualBox recognizes, then these two, type and version, should already be filled out for you. Because this is Arch, there is no unintended install, so that's grayed out, and we have a warning about that. Click Next. This is where we assign RAM and CPU. The red zones would interfere with the operation of the host machine, so we want to keep our RAM and CPU assignments in the green zone. For this machine, I'm going to assign 4 gigabytes of RAM and 2 CPUs. VirtualBox doesn't natively support EFI out of the box. You have to select it if you want to do an EFI, otherwise it's MBR. Click Next. Now we need to create our virtual hard drive. We're not using an existing hard drive, and we're not running without a hard drive. We're going to make this virtual hard drive 40 gigabytes in size. We are not going to pre-allocate the full size, so we'll start small, and as we add stuff, it'll get bigger. Pre-allocating can run faster, but it also takes up more space on your hard drive. A quick review of all our parameters, and then click Finish. However, do not, and I repeat, do not start your virtual machine yet. We want to play with the settings a little bit first. We want to go to Settings. There are a couple things we want to look at and a couple things we might want to change. Under the General tab, Description, you can write a description of your virtual machine. I usually put in a name, a date, and a description of the current state of the machine, and update this as I update the machine, or clone it and make other machines. Again, something meaningful to you should go in here. Under the server, I'm going to uncheck the floppy drive, and I'm going to move the hard drive to the top of the boot list. We will still boot off the optical drive as long as the hard drive isn't formatted. Once it's formatted, we'll boot off it instead of the CD-ROM. Video memory is something we will play with if we're going to add a GUI to the system, which I will do in a clone of it. You can select your drivers here. Some will give you errors, but I found that most will work when you run with them, regardless of the errors. We also want to check our drives to make sure they're all installed. And then we can go ahead and look at the network settings. In this version, I'm using one adapter. If I was making, say, a router, I'd create 2 or more adapters. There's an advanced mode where you can do some more settings. Serial ports I won't be using. USB settings I'm going to leave as they are. There's no shared folder, no possibility of it until we install the guest extensions. And this is just some more information on the machine. So at this point, we should be ready to start the machine. First run of our virtual machine. On this first time run, I want to note that a lot of this stuff we're going to do here is optional depending on your situation. For example, with the US keyboard being default, you don't really need to set the keyboard in the US. If you're on a known system and you know the network works with Arch, you probably really don't need to test it. These are just things you might want to do while you're getting ready to install to make sure everything's the way you want it. So again, optional. To start the machine, you can either double click on it or you can click it once and hit the start icon. Your virtual machine will start up or spin up, as I like to say. This will take a few moments. You should get a window, command line style. Select the first option in the boot up screen. There will be a bit of text flowing across the screen as you go. After several moments, you will arrive at a command line. I'm going to go ahead and increase the size of the window by going to full screen and increasing the scaling. I'm going to also increase the font size here by setting a new font. Then I'm going to clear the screen, and now we can move on. Now that I have the virtual machine spun up and running, I'm going to go ahead and test my network connection. You can do this a couple of ways. I'm going to use IP link first. That's IP space link. And we can see our network adapter. You can also use IP space A. It'll give you slightly different information, but it will still show you your network adapter. And finally, to prove the network is working, I'm going to try and ping a known site. In this case, I'm going to be using archlinux.org. -C6 command to just send 6 pings. -C controls the number of pings you send. And we can see our network is working. We also want to make sure we booted into EFI mode. So we'll check this by looking at a directory. So the directory we're going to look at is sys/firmware/EFI /EFI variables or VARS. If there are files in this folder and it doesn't give us an error, then we booted in EFI mode. If we get an error or this folder is empty, we are probably not in EFI mode. Something else you may want to do, depending on where you are in the world, is check your key map to make sure it'll work for you. We can look in the user share KBD key maps directory. The double star will search all folders within that directory, and then we're looking for folders that end in map.gz. Unfortunately, this is going to be a lot of files and will most likely scroll off the screen. We can do it again, only this time we can pipe it into the LESS command, which is a text viewer, and now we can use the arrow keys to scroll up and down. You're going to have to dig out the file name from or the name we want on the keyboard from the file name, but it's in there. Another way to do this, we can use a locale control CTL list key maps. And this should give us a list of the key maps by the key map name only, and we can also use the arrow keys to scroll up and down to find the one we want. In our case, we're using a US, which is the default keyboard. You don't need to really change it if you are in the US. As an example, we'll use load key maps US, and that should set our key map to the US or whatever region you're using. But as I said, US is the default for this. The next thing I'm going to want to do is sync my repositories. I will use the pacman command for this with the -s option. And this will be modified with the Y option. And this will basically sync all the standard Arch repositories. Now, just for fun, we're going to use pacman-s to load NeoFetch. We say yes to load the file. It just takes a moment. We'll clear the screen and go ahead and run NeoFetch to see what it tells us about our virtual machine. And this is the output of NeoFetch, and you can see the various information about the virtual machine we're running. Preparing the virtual drive. This is where we actually get to installing Arch on our virtual machine. So first thing we want to do is make sure we know which drive we're working with. There are several ways to do this. You can use fdisk-l to list all the drives and various information about them, and you can find the one you want. In this case, it's /dev/sda. You could also use ls-block to list the drives, in which case you get sda. Just need to know it's in the dev directory. Once we've found the drive, we can work on partitioning the drive for this Arch installation. You can always use fdisk. This is an older command driven by its own command menus. If you do fdisk-help, you'll get a list of these commands. And from inside fdisk, it's fdisk/dev/sda. And if you press M for help, you'll basically get the same list of commands. We're going to quit this, and instead, for this particular install, we're going to use cfdisk, which has a much more modern interface. Again, it's /dev/sda. The first thing we do is select what type of drive we want it to be. Since this is going to be an EFI installation, we want it to be a GPT. Then we move on to partitioning. You find the options at the bottom of the screen. So our first partition is going to be a 512 megabyte partition for our GPT. Our next one's going to be for our 2 gig swap partition. We can argue about swap, but that's not the purpose of this video. After that, we're going to add a 25 gig root partition and finally finish up with a home partition. Now, since our first partition is going to be EFI, we need to change the file system type to EFI system. And since our second partition is going to be a swap partition, we need to change the file system to Linux swap. The other two file systems are fine the way they are, and we can go ahead and write to the drive and then quit, and we will have partitioned our drive at this point. Note, you have to type yes to quit. It's not enough to just partition a drive. Now we need to format the drives with the correct format. We'll be using the make file system command. Initially, we're going to use make file system fat with a -F32, and this will be used on /dev/SDA1 or the EFI partition. It needs to be fat formatted. Next, we'll use make swap for dev SDA2 to make it a swap partition. Then we'll use makefs mkfs.ext4 to make /dev/SDA3 a Linux partition. It already is, but we'll format it Linux ext4. We're going to do the same thing with the final partition or home partition. SDA4 is also going to be formatted ext4. Once we're finished with this, our drive is basically ready for use. Our final step before we can actually install Arch is to mount the drive to a mount point on our virtual RAM drive or virtual RAM Arch install. We'll use the /mnt point as that's what it's there for. We'll mount SDA3 as our root file system right at /mnt. We'll turn the swap on with the swap on command for SDA2. And finally, we will mount SDA4 to /mnt/home. We're going to have to make the home folder first to mount it to. But once we make that, then we mount it. Then we mount /dev/SDA4 to /mount/home. We should now be ready to install everything. From this point on, we will be working with the actual virtual drive in our virtual Arch machine. I mean, that sounds kind of silly to call it an actual drive, but from this point on, any changes we make will affect our virtual machine's restart. Anything before this, and if we just restarted our virtual machine, we'd be right back to ground zero as our previous changes were all done to RAM. Again, they were optional changes, but some people will need them. But from this point forward, we're actually writing stuff to our virtual drive. So yeah, we need to pretty much go through this section forward straight to the end of the install. The first step to our install is to use the packstrap program to download from the Arch repositories the latest packages and install them on our virtual drive, which we've mounted at /mnt. We'll use the -K option to create a key ring where we can store our repository keys. We want to install the base system, which is your GNU Linux programs. We want to install the Linux kernel, which is just Linux. This is a virtual machine, so you probably don't need the Linux firmware, but it's not a very big file. On non-virtual machines, actual hardware, you might need some of the drivers in this file. We also want to install sudo for when we create a normal user. I mean, a lot of people do this later, but at least I'm going to do everything right now. We need a text editor. I use VI. You may want to use Nano or some other one. We also need a network manager so we can connect to the network. There are other choices here besides network manager, but that's the one I'm using. We also will install the Intel U code since this is on an Intel-based machine, even if it is a virtual machine. And we will install Grub and the EFI boot manager. Again, many people install these later. I'm just installing them now, getting everything done in one shot. Y to install all the packages, and they will all be sent to the SDA3 mounted as /mnt, which is going to be our root folder. or the root of our file system. At this point, we're actually installing Arch on the drive. How fast this happens is going to depend on the speed of your internet connection. You may just go ahead and fast forward at this point to get to the next step, or not. After we've installed everything, we need to create our fs tab file, which goes in the /etc directory. So we'll use the generate fstab command with the -u option to use universal identifiers and /mount or mnt as our root. And we will write this to /mnt/etc/fstab. Then we can use the cat command to make sure that it's written the way we want it to be written. And you can see we're using the UUID to identify the drives. And you can see we've got root and home, and we've got our swap partition at SDA2. Now we're ready to move on and actually log into our virtual environment. Change root into our virtual machine we just installed, and doing some initial configuration before we restart. To get into our virtual environment without having to restart the computer, we are going to use the arch change root command. And again, the /mnt command is our mount. This will move us into that system, and you can notice how the command prompt has changed to show we're actually using our virtual machine right now. Look at what's in the directory with the ls command. The first thing we want to do with our new Arch install is to link the time zone. We're going to create a symbolic link in the etc directory, but we're going to link it to user share zone info, and then your time zone. In my case, it's US Eastern. I'm going to use the TAC SF options. Again, this creates a link in the etc/local time. Next. We want to set the hardware clock. So use the command HW clock with a /SYSTOHC. Our next task is to set our locale. To do this, we want to edit the file in the etc directory called locale.gen. You can use whatever text editor you want to edit this. I will be using VI. You're going to scroll down and find the entry that corresponds to your locale. Once there, you're going to delete the hash mark to uncomment the line. In my case, I will be using English US UTF-8. Once the line is uncommented, I will save the file. Then I'll run the locale -gen command to actually set my locale. And as you can see, it picked up the English US UTF-8. Our next step is to create a couple of configuration files in the etc directory. There's several ways to do this. You could use a text editor, you could use the touch command. I'm going to use echo to directly write into and create the files I want. So first one is I'm going to echo my language, again, my case English US UTF-8, to etc/locale.config. Next, I'm going to use echo to write my key map equals US to etc or etc/vconsole.config. Then repeat the process, only this time I'm going to send my computer's host name, in this case Archer Base, to the /etc/hostname file. Then we can do an ls to make sure we've created all the configuration files. Now I'm going to set up my localhost file. This file already exists under /etc/hosts. There's nothing but a couple of comments in it at the moment, but I'm going to add some entries to it. So use whatever text editor you want. I'm using VI. The first entry we want to enter is our local host entry 127.0.0.1. Then we want to enter an entry 127.0.1.1 for our host name. Since we're on VirtualBox, we don't do IPv6 in their networking environment, so we don't need to do a local host for IPv6. Save the file and move on. Next, we need to enable our network manager so we can actually get a network connection when we reboot. To do this, we're going to use the systemd system control function, or SYSTEMCTL space enable and then network manager. Make sure you watch the spelling here. It's capital N, capital M. And you should get feedback saying that it has been enabled. Now we need to set a root password so that when we reboot, we can actually log into our system. This is pretty straightforward. We're just going to use the password command, or PASSWD. Without any options, it will do your current account, which is root. We just type your new password. Note the password will not be visible when you're typing it, and you need to re-enter your password a second time. And you should get an update saying password updated successfully. Since we don't want to be doing everything as root, we need to create an unprivileged user. We'll use the user add command with the -m option to create a home directory for this user. Once the user is created, we will use the password command again, but this time with the username to create a password for this user. And now it's finally time to install the bootloader to make all the magic happen. We need to make a directory using makedir. It'll be in boot/EFI. The boot directory already exists. We need to create the EFI directory under it. Then we need to mount our EFI drive SDA1 to this directory. Now we can run the grub install command to install our bootloader. This has a bunch of options. We're going to use first one's /target. This is an x86 computer using a 64-bit and EFI. So that's what we put here, x86_64-EFI. Space and a double dash. Now we want to set the identity of the bootloader. It's going to be grub. Space, a double dash. And now we want to set our EFI directory, which is going to be the one we just created. So /boot/EFI. Hit return to run the installer, and hopefully we get a finished with no error reported. After this, we need to configure grub, so we're going to use the grub make config command. We're using the -o option, and we're going to store the configuration file in boot/grub, and we're going to call it grub.cfg. And hopefully finished with no errors. Note that the OS prober is disabled, so we will only have our Arch entry. And now we're ready to actually reboot. So first thing we need to do is exit our virtual environment. So we're back to our RAM environment, and then we need to issue the reboot command. Our virtual machine will start up, or virtual machine will shut down, then start up. You should see the grub bootloader screen, and we should actually boot now into our virtual machine we just created. If everything went right, we should be at the login prompt. You'll notice we lost our bigger fonts. Let's go ahead and log in as root with the root password. Once we're logged in, let's go ahead and update Pacman with the capital SYU command. Should always update Pacman when you log in. Since this is a new system, there's nothing that needs to be updated. Now we use Pacman-S, and we're going to reinstall NeoFetch on our actual system. I'm also going to install the Terminus fonts, so I can go back to a larger font. Hit yes, and the program should be installed. I'll use the set font command again to install or to start using the Terminus font, specifically TER-122B. You'll notice we lost our pretty colors. This is something we can set up in our user directory. And let's go ahead and run NeoFetch so we can see all the information about our new system. I'm going to end things here because this video is running kind of long. There's so much more to do that it'll have to wait for a different time.
Okay, that was pretty much it. I mean, there was a lot of other stuff we could do after the install on our first login, but I wanted to keep this video to a reasonable time frame. I'll do another video later with some of the other stuff we can do with Arch. But for right now, we did our install and that was our purpose, and all's good. So see you next time.